Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack something pretty incredible, how a single ancient construction project quite literally secured the survival of an entire nation. We're diving into the book of Ezra to explore the absolute historical necessity of Zerubbabel's temple. It's an epic story of exile, completely miraculous returns, and a totally unwavering commitment to a really fragile foundation.
Imagine this for a second. Try to picture the sheer existential crisis facing the exiled Jews in Babylon. You've got an entire nation's identity just hanging by a thread, right? They're completely displaced from their homeland, swallowed up by a massive dominant pagan culture. If they just gave in and assimilated, well, their history, their covenant, their entire future would just vanish into the Babylonian sands. For sure, their survival absolutely hinged on finding a way home and rebuilding.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the exile's existential threat.
Now, think back to 586 BC. King Nebuchadnezzar didn't just conquer Jerusalem, he completely leveled the temple, basically severing the absolute lifeblood of the nation's relationship with God. But take a look at the timeline here. Notice the precise 70-year gap between the temple's destruction and its rededication in 1516 BC? Well, decades earlier, the prophet Jeremiah had actually predicted exactly that, a 70-year captivity. Fulfilling that timeline just shows this staggering historical precision, perfectly mapping out the window of their exile and restoration.
Here's the thing you really need to grasp. Without this physical structure, the Jewish people were in serious danger of total assimilation. They'd just blend right into Babylonian culture. You see, the temple wasn't just some local community center. It was literally the only acceptable place for their sacrificial system. Without it, no visible sign of God's presence, no anchor to their past, they were in real danger of forgetting who they were entirely.
Which brings us to Section 2, a surprising Persian catalyst.
Okay, so the Babylonian Empire gets overthrown by the Medo-Persians in 539 BC, and almost overnight, the whole political landscape completely shifts. Enter King Cyrus. He is a brilliant example of profound historical irony. I mean, in his very first year ruling Babylon, this pagan king issues a royal decree to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And what's super cool is that his broader policy, sending displaced peoples home and rebuilding their sanctuaries, is actually independently confirmed by archaeology, specifically the famous Cyrus Cylinder. So God essentially used the most powerful monarch on the planet to kick off this massive rescue mission.
And Cyrus didn't just say, yeah, sure, you can go. No, he astonishingly handed back 5,400 stolen articles of gold and silver to the Jewish people. These were the exact same sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered from Solomon's temple decades ago. To put that into perspective, it's basically the ancient equivalent of a multi-billion-dollar royal stimulus package. He even decreed that the rebuilding expenses would be paid directly out of the royal treasury. Just wild.
So, fueled by this decree, a small yet fiercely devoted remnant of nearly 50,000 returnees pack up and make the journey back to Jerusalem. And this was no walk in the park. It was a grueling 4-month, 900-mile trek on foot. Think about the massive commitment that required. This wasn't some casual weekend move. The registry in the book of Ezra actually carefully records these families, because when it came to restoring this community, literally every single name mattered.
Let's move right along to Section 3, Rebuilding the Covenant Center. All right, so they finally make it back to a homeland that is just desolate. But they know exactly what their most critical task is. Led by their civil leaders Zerubbabel and the high priest Jeshua, they understand that the temple is their covenant center. It's the glue. Without it, the nation simply can't fulfill its obligations or keep its unique identity. They knew their ancestors went into exile specifically because they abandoned that covenant, right? So this new generation, they were dead set on getting it right. They actually reinstituted the daily sacrifices before the temple walls were even up, which just shows this desperate, passionate return to their covenant with God. Then we hit the year 536 BC, and it brings this deeply bittersweet moment to Jerusalem. When the builders finally laid the foundation, it was just an explosion of emotion. The priests and Levites are singing, praising God, and the younger generation is absolutely losing their minds with joy. But right next to them, the older men, the ones who actually remembered the sheer massive glory of Solomon's original temple, they were weeping loudly. So you have this overwhelming sound of joyful shouting completely tangled up with bitter crying, to the point where people watching couldn't even tell the difference between the two sounds.
But of course, it wasn't all celebrations. Let's look at Section 4, Overcoming Decades of Opposition.
Yeah, that emotional high, it crashed into a brick wall of harsh reality pretty fast. Surrounding adversaries stalled the construction for decades. They used this highly calculated three-step strategy to take the builders down. First, they tried to infiltrate. They offered fake help, claiming they worshiped the same God. Well, Zerubbabel fought right through that and immediately shut it down to keep the work pure. When that didn't work, they pivoted to intimidation, literally frightening the workers and bribing officials to work against them. And finally, they used legislation, writing these letters to Persian kings full of false accusations, basically claiming the Jews were planning a massive rebellion.
And sadly, it worked. 16 long years. That is how long this monumental project sat completely frozen. You can see it right here. All that external pressure worked, but worse, it bred this deep internal spiritual lethargy. The people actually started building up their own fancy paneled houses while the house of God just sat there in ruins. Honestly, it took the fiery preaching of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah in 520 BC to finally wake everyone up, reignite their courage, and get the hammers swinging again.
Now this is honestly my favorite part. Talk about a plan totally backfiring. A local Persian governor named Tatnai sees the construction starting up again, and he immediately writes to King Darius trying to shut the whole thing down. He's like, did Cyrus really give them permission for this? So, Darius actually goes and checks the historical archives in Ecbatana, finds the original decree, and basically tells Tatnai to back way off. But wait, it gets better. Darius orders Tatnai to use his own local tax revenues to pay for the complete construction costs and provide the daily animals for their sacrifices. Just incredible.
All right, let's wrap this up with Section 5, the Messianic ripple effect.
So, we've talked a lot about stone and timber, royal decrees, and ancient politics. But what's the big so what here? Well, the ultimate significance of Zerubbabel's temple reaches way, way beyond the 6th century BC. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, who by the way was the grandson of the exiled king Jehoiachin, completing this temple directly preserved the Davidic lineage all the way down to Jesus. By getting that spiritual center back up and running, they stopped the Jewish people from dissolving into the surrounding pagan nations. They kept the community completely intact, and that is exactly what preserved the physical royal bloodline that we see recorded centuries later in the Gospel of Matthew. Simply put, without this specific return, there is no Davidic line in the land, and without that line, there is no Messiah. So your biggest takeaway today should be this. If that temple project had failed, the royal bloodline and the entire covenant community would have just perished right there in Babylon. All those ancient promises made to David about an eternal throne? Severed. Gone. That relatively small structure, built by a tired, scared remnant of exiles, was quite literally the exact instrument God used to secure the future of humanity.
Which leaves us with this final thought. How often does the survival of an entire movement, or even a culture, hinge on a single, fragile foundation built against all odds? I mean, that group of 50,000 returnees probably felt like a tiny drop in a massive Persian bucket. Yet their commitment to a seemingly impossible task literally laid the groundwork for history's greatest chapters. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep your eyes peeled for those pivotal, foundational moments in history.